Here is a turquoise ink by Sailor Studio 841. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook. There is such a strong blue lean to this turquoise that at first I thought it was a blue. So if you generally do go for turquoise, if you generally do not go for turquoise, but want one in your collection, then this is a great option because it is very blue leaning. Now, the swatch shows some sheen in the top left corner when it gets to that point in the video, though I never saw it in any of the writing samples. You know what this does have, though? Some tone variation by nib, and it really does always look good. You know what else? It shades pretty decent. Because this is so blue leaning, and I generally don't go for a turquoise, it's the blue lean that really made me very happy and enjoyed using this ink very much the entire time. The pen for today is a Lamy 2000. All of the writing samples are done with a Platinum 3776 with a soft fine nib which writes rather dry, a Hero 7035 with a fine nib that writes wet, a Visconti Van Gogh with a medium nib and an average flow, a Lamy Safari with a broad nib that writes average. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there, starting with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the soft fine nib, we see quite a bit of that turquoise lean really coming through. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it does shade very well, and really showing us both the turquoise and the blue. Those darker areas, certainly blue. Take a look at how on the first line going darker to lighter. Same thing happens with 2 right next to it. Fine goes from nice lighter midtones, much darker at the D. We really get to see the blues and the turquoise in both of this. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine nib. There's no feathering, there is no spread. It's quite a bit more blue than turquoise here. It does shade, and because it's darker and more blue, when it shades, it is there. It's not as standout, but looking at the third line, his and island, you really do see the shading coming through well there. Not that it's not shading in other areas, just that I think it stands out especially well to really see it there. Looking at the medium nib, it is a little bit darker than it was with the wet fine nib, really showing off that blue with little bits of turquoise. There is no feathering, there is no spread. I already said it, there is some shading because it shows off some of the turquoise in lighter tones. When you see where is it, the is part, you see the darker and the lighter tones. Directly underneath it, heard starts as a nice midtone, shows off the turquoise a little bit at the E, darkens up to a blue at the A, lightens up again at the RD, darkening at the end of the D. Very nice in what's happening, really showing off the spectrum that's available in this in its shading. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium. There is no feathering. There is no spread. The shading, I think, shows off fairly decent. It gives some darker spots throughout most of what happens, but the darker spots are a darker letter kind of per word. We get a lot of the turquoise lean. The dark parts really do come in as a blue, but I'm seeing much more of it as a turquoise, similar to what was on the soft fine. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle.
This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelican M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There is approximately 7 milliliters of ink left.
The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it's about as dark as it was on the Clairfontaine, but not showing the turquoise as much. More showing as a lighter and darker blue throughout, so slight spoiler there, as it has no feathering and it has no spread. It does shade. I don't think it's shading as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, but I do think it's showing very nicely. Take a look at Shrieked on the second line. Nice lighter and darker tones shifting in and out from letter to letter just about. Same thing happens with Golem right next to it. So I think the shading and what we're getting here looks especially nice. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine, just about as dark as it was on the Clairfontaine. Same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, and we get no shading, but we get a very consistent, nice looking ink on the page. Looking at the medium nib, it is a little darker than it was with the wet fine nib. No feathering, it's very close, maybe a tiny bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. The tone is the thing that it's a little bit lighter, but it's the color itself. We see, I want to say, more of the turquoise here, strangely, compared to what happened with the soft fine. No feather, no spread. Yes, it shades. It shades more in downstroke areas than anywhere else, like the D on and, the D on promise, the exclamation point, the downstroke of the C on come on a second line. So it's definitely there and doing a very nice job. Medium nib would be a good choice on this paper. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium, about the same tone as the Clairfontaine. No feathering, no spread, not a blue so much as a very light blue that has a turquoise lean, similar to what we had on the Clairfontaine. It does shade only in a couple spots, like the exclamation or comma. You see it a little bit on the S of as in the third line, but not really something you're running to as a shading. But take a look at utterly on the second line, and we see that it goes from darker to mid-tones. So the shading that's there is much more subtle, but it's really not coming through all that stand out here. Looking at the back of the page, we have no bleeding, no ghosting, and can easily write back here.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting it into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, the most noticeable thing is that it's the same darkness, but it is definitely looking like a green leaning turquoise here, not like a blue leaning turquoise at all. No feather, no spread. It is shading very well. You see it in find on the first line, heart on the second line. He had feeling. That anything, Golem, all of it is shading, and it's doing a great job for it, where often the soft fine brings out weaknesses of this ink. On this paper, though it's leaning green now, it really does look very nice. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, about as dark as it was on the Clairfontaine, yet green, not blue, as a turquoise, with no feathering, with no spread, with some shading. Shades about as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. On the first line comes, starts darker, works its way lighter, along starts darker and works its way lighter, where precious in the second line is a nice darker tone the entire way. Looking at the medium nib, it is right about the same tone as the wet fine nib. Green and not blue in comparison to the Clairfontaine. Tiny bit lighter, I think, than the Clairfontaine as far as the darkness of the tone, with no feathering, with no spread, with some bits of shading that I think, while there's not a ton of them, I think they show very nicely. The R of never, the D of said, the S's of guessed. I think it looks fairly nice, and I'm pretty happy with what I'm seeing here, even though it was a blue leaning. I know the paper changes tone very frequently. Looking at the broad nib, it is a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine, a little bit lighter as far as darkness goes than on the Clairfontaine. The first thing I said was Clairfontaine. I meant the medium. A little bit lighter than it was in tone on the Clairfontaine. Definitely a green-leaning turquoise, not a blue-leaning turquoise. You saw it as a turquoise on Clairfontaine. You see it as more like a seafoam green here. It's got no feathering. It's got no spread. Really great performance. Love how this paper does. It doesn't really shade. There's one or two tiny spots that are a little bit darker. Not really worth drawing the attention to. More what we get is a very interesting looking color on this paper. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, we get the same tone we had on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get shading. Now the shading is there, not as dark as it came through on the Clairfontaine. While the shading wasn't always a huge standout thing, it was darker than it is here. We see, if you look at Bilbo on the first line, the B to O. Much darker at the bottom of the B into the O, but that's not a constant thing. So it does shade, but if this was the paper I was looking at, I would largely call it a non-shader. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It has no feather. It has no spread. It has almost nothing for shading. I mean, there's some darker spots. Look at 4 on the first line. Starts darker and gets lighter. Sure, brooded, the B and the D are darker than the roux in the middle, but for the most part, the shading is there, but not really grabbing my attention. And it just doesn't seem to look as nice. Could be a function of those vertical lines, but I don't think so here. I just think the slight difference in paper makes it look different enough. Looking at the medium nib, it is a little bit darker than it was with the wet fine, little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread. We do get shading. I think the shading's coming through much better here than it has on the previous 2 nibs with this paper. I even think the shading's showing up nicer than it did on the Clairfontaine. Look at delay on the second line. Midtone, very dark in the middle, lightens up at the Y. After goes lighter to darker, pretty on the second line. Nice, easy tone where fairly starts a little lighter, works its way to a nice darker midtone. But while the shading doesn't seem to make huge changes, I do think what we're getting looks very nice, very pleasing on the eye. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium and a little bit lighter, I think, than the Clairfontaine. It has no feathering. It has no spread. It still shows itself as a turquoise, a blue-leaning turquoise here, more than as a blue. I think it shades a little bit better than it did on the Clairfontaine. Again, it's one of those, how it's coming across, while it's not shading tremendously more or tremendously different, I think the shading itself looks better on this paper because I'm looking at them side by side as I'm doing this. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Diatramentis Charlemagne, or turquoise. Here is Pilot Mixable Turquoise. Here is Sailor Studio 224.
Here is Tasha Hokusai Fukaki Hanada.
The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is a little bit lighter as far as darkness goes compared to the Clairfontaine. Notably, it is really a green leaning turquoise over a blue leaning turquoise as an effect of the paper, with no feathering, with no spread. The shading is showing better than it did here, I think because it's showing as a green opposed to a blue. Greens do tend to shade fairly well. Take a look at Bilbo on the second line. Lighter to nice and dark right in the middle. Lightens up at the end. What? Underneath the H is much darker than the rest of the word have. Starts darker, gets lighter, gets darker again. Nice in what's happening. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a little bit, just a tad bit darker than it was with the soft fine on this paper, quite a bit lighter in tone than on the Clairfontaine. Once again, still a green leaning turquoise, not a blue leaning turquoise anymore, with no feather, with no spread, with really nice shading coming through all the way. Not super dark in its shading, but you're definitely seeing your darker and your lighter tones. You see it in louder on the second line where it starts darker, gets light, gets darker again at the D-E-R. Sharpen on the second line, starts light, gets dark at the H. Lightens up through the middle of the word, darkens up at the P-E towards the end, where towards on the third line is much lighter compared to it right next to it. Looking at the medium nib, it is a bit darker than it was with the wet fine nib, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, with no feathering, with no spread, with almost nothing for shading. I mean, there's a couple dark spots, but barely want to call it any kind of shading there. We get a very nice looking tone. Again, it's very pleasing in everything this ink is doing, but no real shading here. Looking at the broad nib, it is right about the same tone as it was with the medium nib. Quite a bit lighter in darkness than it was on the Clairfontaine. Definitely a green-leaning turquoise still, where it was a blue-leaning turquoise on the Clairfontaine. No feather, no spread, almost nothing for shading. Now, while it's not all that different than the medium. I don't think it looks as good as the medium. It loses a little bit of something here with the broad nib where, you just go, yeah, no, I get your writing. I get it. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a pink ink by Krishna Mandara. Here is an orange ink by Sailor Kobe number 8. Here is a magenta ink by Diamine Magenta Flash. Here is a yellow ink by Diatramentis Emma Goldman Gold. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is the same darkness as the Clairfontaine. It's definitely turquoise here, and at times has more of a blue lean and times has more of a green lean. Very interesting in what happens. Yes, it feathers very controllably. I can see using it. Yes, it spreads very controllably. I can see using it. I don't think this is bad at all considering the paper. It does have some shading spots, and that's where we see the more blue lean, and the lighter spots in that shading show a bit more of a green lean. Take a look at back on the first line where it starts darker, works its way lighter, a little more green lean. The K, darker, a little more blue lean. Such underneath starts darker, gets lighter, meaning starts kind of green leaning, ends kind of blue leaning. Really very cool, and I hope the camera, because cameras can have trouble with turquoise, especially when it's like this, so I hope it comes through. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine. It's just as dark as it was on the Clairfontaine. A little bit of a green lean to this over a blue lean, still definitely a turquoise. It does feather, it does spread. Both of those, again, I think are kind of under control. Don't hesitate for a moment like you'll see I do on the third line with wretched at the E, because that's going to go ahead and bleed even more. Not something that should be a surprise. Does it shade? It can, but don't really plan on it for this one. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as it was with the wet fine, tiny bit lighter than on the Clairfontaine. Certainly more of a green lean than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather more noticeably than it did with either of the other nibs so far, more noticeably than what's to come with the broad. It does spread more noticeably than it did with any other nib on this paper, including the one you haven't seen yet. It doesn't shade. I do not think this is a great pen to use for this ink on this paper. It's just not really giving it justice. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium, bit lighter in tone than it was on the Clairfontaine in darkness. Certainly a green lean over a blue lean, as it has been here. Yes, it feathers. Yes, it spreads. Neither of those do I see as any kind of a big deal looking at what I see on the page. So it's not a problem. I think it looks much better than it did in the medium, though so much about it is similar. Less feather and less spread makes it a bit nicer. Shading, not here, but it is a copy paper, so you always have to kind of curb your expectations for that. Looking at the back of the page, you can see the ink got quite deep into the paper, meaning you can't write back here because you wouldn't be able to really read either side, but none of this bled through touching the page underneath, making this a great choice for on copy paper.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink? The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
The dry fine or the medium flow broad really showed off the turquoise lean and can be very enjoyable. Just as enjoyable was the look from the wet fine, but for me, it was the medium flow, medium nib that really looked at its best for most of the paper. It was a nice darker tone with just bits of turquoise coming through in the lighter areas of the shading. So a medium flow medium is where I want to go with this.
I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching.